there, ATSEVS533 students. Dr. John Schrage here, giving you lecture 2F, which is the last lecture, actually, of our so-called physical climatology module, the physics of climate or whatever. And, you know, I get it that this has been a tough module. This has been very different than the first module of the course, which probably made you feel, you probably felt pretty confident coming off that first module. But this one has had a whole lot more vocabulary. It's even had some math, at least some analysis of equations. It had certainly a lot more concepts. You'd be forgiven if you're exhausted. And so rather than like go dig into more mathematics or something like that, or more about the physics of all of this concept, as we kind of work our way towards spring break and so on, let's just answer some questions about climate and radiative transfer and so on as a way of kind of extending what we have learned in a more descriptive sort of way. And one topic that we have talked about hit and miss kind of this semester has been ozone. I mean, all of you are survivors of the 113 class. You've already seen a bit about the whole idea about how ozone works. You know that ozone is a form of oxygen. It's O3, in contrast to diatomic or O2, the diatomic oxygen or O2 that we breathe. And you know the whole story about how it's important because it blocks ultraviolet radiation from the sun from reaching the surface of the earth. Both the process of creating ozone and the process of destroying ozone involves absorbing ultraviolet radiation. The chemical reactions, the so-called Chapman production equations, are driven by absorption of ultraviolet radiation. And so, as a consequence, even though there isn't all that much ozone in the Earth's atmosphere, it's more than enough to make the monochromatic optical depth of the atmosphere with respect to ultraviolet radiation relatively large. Practically no ultraviolet radiation makes it to the surface of the Earth. Still enough that we get sunburn and skin cancer and certain autoimmune diseases and so on. But like if you actually take a look at a profile of the quantity of ozone in the Earth's atmosphere, like I provide you here from this journal article, well, if you look with respect to height, you can see that almost all of the world's ozone happens in a relatively narrow range of heights that is not at the surface of the Earth. It's in fact from about 20 kilometers to maybe about 35 kilometers or something like that. Hence the term ozone layer. Okay, it is a layer of the atmosphere in which ozone is comparatively abundant. If you actually look at the x-axis of the graph here, it's actually still not all that abundant in those layers of the atmosphere. It's still a trace gas, but it's enough that it shields the Earth from ultraviolet radiation by absorbing it. And you can see that there's also some ozone closer to the surface of the Earth, but this ozone is actually very important meteorologically because the absorption of ultraviolet radiation, which that ozone in the ozone layer does, is a warming process. Absorbing that energy from the sun causes that layer to get warmer, adding heat to that part of the atmosphere, the stratosphere, which is why actually that temperature structure of the atmosphere is the way it is. I just sort of penciled in green here sort of a temperature profile for the atmosphere, where you can see in the troposphere it starts off warm near the surface and gets colder with respect to height. Back in ATS113, you even learned why that was. It was because the surface is the source of energy for the atmosphere, for the troposphere. The sun's rays shine through the atmosphere, warm the ground, then the ground warms the Earth. But then temperatures increase with respect to height in the stratosphere because of all the absorption of ultraviolet radiation and the warming and so on that's happening due to the ozone layer. Alright, so the temperature structure of the Earth's atmosphere actually depends on this business of the ozone that's in the stratosphere. Now, we know that ozone is a greenhouse gas, and as well as this nifty role that it plays with regard to ultraviolet radiation. In general, human activity has done two things to ozone. We have increased the amount of ozone that is in the troposphere, down where we live, and we have depleted or decreased the amount of ozone that is in the stratosphere. And I've tried to illustrate that with like a blue curve here that's supposed to show like how we are diminishing it and how we're increasing it in the troposphere. I mean, obviously the curve that's in black there that comes from the paper, that's, you know, was done once humans had been affecting the atmosphere. But I'm trying to illustrate how, like, with time, we're making the ozone layer, we are depleting the amount of ozone in the stratosphere, we are increasing the amount of ozone in the troposphere. Tropospheric ozone comes from, and I have the troposphere highlighted there in green, Tropospheric ozone is both a primary and a secondary pollutant in the Earth's atmosphere. Primary in the sense that it comes from point sources. Lots of electronic equipment produces ozone. We can talk more about that at a different time. But it also is a secondary pollutant in that it is formed by chemical reactions that happen in the atmosphere from primary pollutants. So like ozone in general doesn't come out the tailpipe of cars or out the smokestack of coal-fired power plants, but the chemical reactions that happen based on those pollutants can produce ozone as well. There really shouldn't be any tropospheric ozone. All that ozone that's in the troposphere is almost entirely anthropogenic. It's a greenhouse gas, so this is leading to a positive radiative forcing of temperature at the surface of the Earth. We are increasing the amount of, we're driving towards higher temperatures based on tropospheric ozone. Now, up in the stratosphere, which I now have circled there in green, it gets a little bit more complicated because here we have two processes at work here. By depleting the amount of ozone in the stratosphere, we are letting more ultraviolet radiation through. That is a positive radiative forcing. We have reduced the optical depth of the stratosphere with respect to ultraviolet radiation. So now more ultraviolet radiation makes it to the surface of the Earth and warms the Earth. As well as, sunburn, skin cancer, all that kind of good stuff. On the other hand, there's a competing factor. Ozone is a greenhouse gas. By depleting it, we are reducing the greenhouse effect. So stratospheric depletion of the ozone layer is exerting a negative radiative forcing on the temperature of the Earth, letting more long-wave radiation escape. So see how there's two competing things going on in the stratosphere when it comes to ozone depletion? Not ozone itself, ozone depletion. We are exerting a negative radiative forcing by letting more long-wave radiation out, but we are causing a positive radiative forcing by letting more short-wave radiation in. And if you add those two stratospheric effects and model them and so on, what you find out is that the anthropogenic changes in the amount of stratospheric ozone has led to a slight negative radiative forcing in the stratosphere. And in fact, I actually just copied this slide from one of our earlier presentations in this module here. But you remember how we talked about the separated the radiative forcing from each of the trace gases. And you can see at that time we had said that tropospheric ozone had this smallish positive radiative forcing associated with its positive contribution to the radiative forcing at the surface. And it's, in contrast, stratospheric ozone exerts a slight negative radiative forcing. Hey, that tropospheric ozone radiative forcing, it's hardly tiny. It's, a fifth as big as that of carbon dioxide. This is not in the margins. This is something we need to deal with, and that's why we do deal with tropospheric ozone. So we don't really want so much ozone in the troposphere, but I think we can all agree stratospheric ozone, we really want to repair that. And you probably learned in ATSEVS533 that based on things like the Montreal Protocol, we're actually pretty good at no longer producing the chemicals, these chlorofluorocarbons that are depleting the ozone layer. And with time, the ozone layer will recover, but the period of time we're talking about is on the order of decades to centuries. So you might ask, I know as a person who teaches climate and atmospheric science courses, I get asked all the time, why can't we just make more? Why can't we just make bottles of ozone gas, take them up and spray them up there in the stratosphere? Don't do it down here in the troposphere, that's a pollutant. But up in the stratosphere, why can't we do that? Ozone generators exist. That's one right there you can go out and buy. You can buy that on Amazon. Why? Why do we have ozone generators? Well, it turns out among all the other things ozone does that are good and bad, one of the things it can do is it acts as a deodorizer. I don't really understand the physical chemistry of all of that, but it works in a manner not entirely unrelated to how Febreze takes smells out. And so, hotels tend to have an ozone generator in the air handling system to put a small quantity of ozone into the air in all the rooms. And that's because no matter how much they clean them or how many rules they have on the hotel room, somebody has smoked in that room, somebody has had a pet in that room, somebody's had a kid with dirty diapers in that room. No matter how much they clean it, the room is still going to smell. But by adding some ozone to the air, it deodorizes it. This was actually something our students got really interested in a couple of years ago. Oh gosh, it's been almost 10 years ago now. A colleague of ours, her house burned down. And after the house burned down, the things that were salvageable smelled terrible from the smoke and so on. But there are companies like ServiceMaster who the insurance company will pay. They have these chambers that they flood with ozone, and you can put things like your books or your family pictures or mom's wedding dress or whatever into the chamber, and it'll sit there in ozone for a few days, and it'll smell better when it comes out. Okay? Well, so you got to have an ozone generator to do this. Well, okay, if ozone generators exist, and frankly the concentration of ozone is on the order of like parts per billion, why don't we just make more? I mean, we do it even on accident all the time with laser printers and photocopiers and almost anything that has an open spark. Anything, a lot of things produce ozone. My photocopier that I have here in this office, my office here, it produces all kinds of ozone. When it's running, I can really smell it. But here's the deal. Production of ozone takes electricity. It actually takes a lot of electricity per, like, say, mole of the gas. And while it's true that the actual absolute concentration of ozone in the stratosphere is not all that high, the stratosphere is huge. I mean, it's kilometers thick and it covers the entire Earth. So the amount of ozone that it would take to replace the ozone we have the amount of ozone we have destroyed, replacing that would require a huge chunk of the total amount of energy the Earth produces, you know, through coal-fired power plants or whatever. And you can see the problem here, right? I mean, the production of that electricity is not without consequences for the environment as well. So this is not really a viable solution. Plus, we would go to all this work to make all this ozone, and the truth of the matter is all those horrible chlorofluorocarbon molecules are still up there. That's the problem. We don't have a good way to get rid of the freon and the halon and all that kind of stuff that we've added to the stratosphere in the first place. So until that is naturally removed by various processes, there's really no point in trying to go to all this work to make ozone. Well, you know, while we're in the process of talking about the kind of things that a guy who teaches environmental science, atmospheric science, climate science type classes, the kind of things I get asked all the time, and you should see what my inbox looks like. I get asked all kinds of crazy stuff. Not to mention comments on YouTube, Lord. Lots of people want to know, why don't we just filter the carbon dioxide out? I have a picture in my mind that they think we're going to have something like a butterfly net, that we swing through the atmosphere, we filter stuff out. To which I always wonder, have they ever tried separating a solution before? I mean, the carbon dioxide is dissolved into the atmosphere. I mean, if I gave you a pitcher of Kool-Aid and told you to separate out the sugar, that's an enormously difficult job. I mean, you could boil off the water and at least just have the food coloring and the sugar, but separating like the food coloring and the flavorings from the sugar would be an enormous job. It can be done, but the amount of energy and so on involved would be huge. It would never be easy or cheap to figure out how to get the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But that being said, there are actually techniques we could talk about. I mean, for example, we already have a low-tech solution for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's called plants. I mean, what plants do is they remove carbon dioxide molecules from the atmosphere in a very cool series of processes that, you know, they use to produce food and so on. And, well, we could grow trees or on land, or we could do things like fertilize areas of the ocean to produce more algae, or we could... But here's the deal. I don't want to get all bogged down in the details of the carbon cycle in this class, but most of that doesn't really help, because if we, say, grew some cornfield and the corn is absorbed, you know, the plants are absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you know, about 40% of the mass of a corn plant is carbon. But the problem is, at the end of the life cycle of the plant, at the end of the season, the plant breaks down, fungi and various other things decompose it, and their respiration returns the carbon back to the atmosphere. There's no net change. The only way you're going to get a net change to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is if you don't let the carbon return to the atmosphere after the end of the life cycle of the plant by, like, burying it. So there are these proposals for low-tech, biologically based removal systems where we deliberately take plant material and keep its carbon from returning to the atmosphere by, like, burying it. For example, here is a giant pile of broken leaves and broken twigs and stuff like that. It's like from a storm. It was the dumping area after, like, for yard waste after a storm. And there's tons and tons of carbon right there. What's really going to happen is the city's going to mulch it or use it as compost or something like that in the parks, and that's lovely. There's good budget reasons why they do things like that and so on. But 6 months from now, all that carbon's going to be back in the atmosphere. There's no net improvement. from a climate perspective. If we wanted to have a climate improvement, dig a hole and stick the stuff in it. A deep hole so that the carbon doesn't come, it's an anoxic environment and you're not going to let any decomposition happen and there's no release of carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. In fact, this could in fact work. In some of my classes, we've actually done the math of something like this, where, for example, we could talk about what if the city of Omaha wanted to go carbon neutral with regard to transportation, and they wanted to just grow a field of alfalfa. And the alfalfa, of course, absorbs carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere, just like the cars in Omaha are giving off carbon dioxide anthropogenically. And we said, we're going to just cut down the alfalfa and bury it in this old salt mine or something like that. And we're going to go carbon neutral. How big of an alfalfa field would you need? And the students would have to look up like how many tons of carbon an acre of alfalfa produces per year, captures per year, and so on. And it turns out that you could make Omaha carbon neutral with regard to transportation anyway, with an area about the size of a county of alfalfa. Where if you just dedicated, we're going to use this flattened Cumming County, and we're going to use in northeast Nebraska, and we're going to just use all of that to grow alfalfa. We'll bale it up and dump it into the salt mine out here, and we're going to bury it for 1,000 years. You could do it, and it would work. It would not be easy, and that's land that's already being used for something else, you know, production of food. So it would ultimately drive food prices up. But this is a possibility. Biomass burying is not necessarily the world's worst idea. Okay, it's just that you are making a choice about how you're using arable land. Now, you could also talk about like high-tech solutions. High-tech solutions like, you know, literally using some kind of chemical scrubber to remove carbon dioxide. We actually have a rather elaborate physical chemistry community that is in the business of figuring out how to scrub one gas out of another. For example, when we extract natural gas from a natural gas well, it's not pure methane. There's all kinds of other stuff in it. There's a whole industry that is about how you separate the gases and so on. And these kind of chemical scrubbers exist, and we could make some kind of way that would, you know, when air would pass through some kind of system, and we would scrub some of the carbon dioxide out using some kind of chemical absorber that gets recovered and purified and so on. This particular picture here is actually just a computer bot rendering of what something like that could look like. But you can well imagine such things have been proposed and, you know, test studies and so on. But you can imagine this gets incredibly complicated, and you've got the question of what you're going to do with the carbon dioxide that you capture. I mean, we could recover it and compress it or liquefy it or whatever and then bury it someplace. You could envision there being like tanks or something underground. But we'll get more to how you're going to get rid of that carbon in just a little bit. But whether we do this with a low-tech solution like biomass burying or a high-tech solution like some kind of chemical scrubber, either way, doing this on a large enough scale to make a real difference is going to be really hard. Because here's the deal. We need to, well, let's actually talk about it in terms of the carbon cycle. This is a diagram that I use when I'm talking to classes about the carbon cycle. Each of those kind of grayish-brown shapes there represents a reservoir of carbon in the Earth system. So, like, we could talk about going from left to right here, we could talk about, like, the land biosphere, like forests and crops and stuff like that, and they hold about 2,000 gigatons of carbon. And there's similarly about 740 gigatons of carbon that's in the form of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. And then those two that are kind of stacked on top of each other are two different parts of the ocean. The near-surface part of the ocean, which is called the mixed layer, which has about a teraton of carbon in it, and the deep ocean, which has 38 teratons, 38,000 gigatons of carbon in it. And all of that is dwarfed by what's in the lithosphere, the rocks of the Earth. That's both in the form of like petroleum products as well as like or precursors of petroleum or whatever you say, or coal or something, but also carbon compounds and minerals and things like that, like limestone and so on. I mean, there we're talking millions and millions of gigatons. That is a vast reservoir. Now, obviously, in the natural system, carbon moves back and forth between these systems. For example, the processes of respiration and photosynthesis represent a perfectly natural way that carbon moves back and forth between the atmosphere and the land biosphere. That happens on the rate of about 100 gigatons a year, as you can illustrate with those little arrows right there. And over the course of a year, it basically balances out. And similarly, there's a transfer of carbon between the atmosphere and the ocean as carbon dioxide gets bubbled into the atmosphere, gets dissolved into the ocean, and emerges from the ocean in the form of like methane bubbles and things like that. There's a cycle to these things, but they're basically balanced. There's even a small transfer of carbon naturally between the lithosphere of rocks and so on and the more surface system here, just due to things like venting of swamp gases or chemical weathering of rocks and things like that. But it's small, on the order of 0.1 gigatons per year. But here's the deal. Humans have found an anthropogenic way to sidestep this system here. We are really good at moving carbon from the lithosphere of rocks to the atmosphere through the extraction of coal or petroleum or natural gas or whatever. And we do that at a rate of about 9 gigatons a year. We do this on an industrial scale with ships bigger than the town I grew up in. And we take the entire tops off mountains to get to the carbon that's inside there. We do this on an industrial scale. So just to balance the amount of carbon that we move from the lithosphere into the atmosphere, we would need to find ways to remove about 9 gigatons of carbon per year. Well, if we're going to be doing that, let's say, with biomass burying, okay, so we need to move carbon from the atmosphere into plants. Well, that naturally happens at about a rate of about 100 gigatons per year, and we need to add about 10% more of that. About 9 more gigatons are going to have to be added to the land biosphere for us then to cut down and stick in a hole someplace. Holy smokes, how are we going to grow 10% more plant material on the surface of the Earth? It's probably not surprising. This has to be done at about the same rate we are adding carbon to the atmosphere. If your power plant has a trainload of coal showing up every day rather, about that same amount of biomass would have to be buried every day. This is a whole industrial scale here. So in order to keep these temperature rises from getting more than about 2 degrees Celsius, which is sort of our target that we hope for, because that's about how much committed warming there already is, we would have to remove from the atmosphere at least a few billion tons of carbon per year, maybe as much as 10 billion tons of carbon per year. Well, that's basically the rate at which we add it. Which of course makes sense. We'd have to remove it about the rate we're adding it. I have a hard time picturing like whole oil tankers. Okay, a petroleum tanker comes from the Middle East into Port Sulphur in Louisiana, unloads all its petroleum and loads up with lumber, cut down silage, corn, what is this going to be? And then takes it back to the Middle East and buries it someplace. I have a hard time picturing us actually doing something like this. We'll come back to more of these challenges associated with these these problems that we have caused with our carbon emissions. But let's talk about something else you hear when people are talking about the whole climate change problem. I hear that carbon dioxide is green. You hear people say green, not like in its color, as in like it's actually good for the environment. You can go and find these websites. This happens to be coming from plantsneedco2.org. Carbon dioxide is green. Like, for example, this guy grew 4 different saplings in controlled chambers with different levels of carbon dioxide in them, and you can see that the plant did do better, okay, when there was more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is plant food, right? How is this a bad thing? And like, for example, I just captured this off of Slate.com the other day. Justice Alito declares carbon dioxide is not a pollutant in a candid and confused speech. Where does this come from, this idea that carbon dioxide isn't a pollutant? Well, it's actually kind of a semantic trick. Here's the deal. Actually, by some of our definitions of air pollution and pollutant and so on, carbon dioxide doesn't quite fit, but that's more a problem of our definition than a problem of like, no, carbon dioxide isn't bad. Here I just took from the Glossary of Meteorology a definition of air pollution, and it's the presence of substances in the atmosphere, particularly those that do not occur naturally. I think we could all agree. But when you look a little farther down into the definition, air pollution usually designates the collection of substances that adversely affects human health, animals, and plants. Deteriorates structure. Wait a minute. Does carbon dioxide fit that? It actually helps plants grow. We saw that on the Plants Need CO2 website. And yes, high concentrations of carbon dioxide can kill you. We'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But not the concentrations we're talking about in our atmosphere, it is not harmful to our health. So by definitions like this, or the somewhat fussier definition the EPA uses and so on, carbon dioxide doesn't meet the definition of a pollutant. I understand where that's coming from, but that's just sort of a semantic thing. I mean, obviously the carbon dioxide does affect the health of the plants and the animals and so on when it results in climate change, right? Under the same temperature, the plants will thrive more when they have more carbon dioxide, but they're not going to keep the same climate environment. They're going to be experiencing a warmer and warmer temperature, which might eventually cause problems for their health or something. So this whole idea that carbon dioxide is green is part of the problem here. I mean, again, if we turn back to that diagram that we had that kind of sketches out the basics of the carbon cycle here, well, what that idea here is saying is that, well, if we enhance the amount of carbon dioxide being stored in the atmosphere, what that will do is drive more flux of carbon from the atmosphere into the land biosphere. The plants need that. They will respond due to raising carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. They will respond by growing more. We'll have an enhanced flux towards the land biosphere. For that matter, we'll also have an enhanced flux towards the ocean as we dissolve more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but that's not from the atmosphere into the ocean. But that's not necessarily a good thing. That leads to ocean acidification and so on. But here's the deal. This has been observed. We actually know this is happening. If you take the total amount of carbon dioxide humans have added to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution and add that to how much carbon dioxide was here before, pre-industrially, it doesn't add up to what we see now. A big chunk of the total amount of carbon dioxide that we have added to the atmosphere is missing. The so-called missing carbon dioxide. Well, it's because the plants are already doing us a favor. The plants are already thriving more than they did. The total amount of carbon being stored in the land biosphere already is more than it was prior to the pre-industrial area. A lot of that missing carbon is also being stored in the ocean as it dissolves into ocean water. And see, none of this is a good long-term solution to our problems about greenhouse gases and so on, because most of that enhancement is happening on the plants with short lives. I mean, you know, again, the corn grows a little faster or a little taller, or the lawn grows a little faster or a little taller because it's exposed to 400 parts per million instead of the pre-industrial 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide. But here's the deal. Within months, all that carbon is going to be back in the atmosphere. We'll have mowed the grass clippings will have decomposed, and then it'll be back in the atmosphere. Or the corn will be harvested, the plants will have been cut down, they'll decompose, and it's back in the atmosphere. That does no long-term good. Even things like forests, which we think of as sequestering carbon for long periods of time, the majority of the mass of carbon that they pull from the atmosphere each growing season goes into leaves. And the leaves fall off at the end of the year and decompose and return that carbon back to the atmosphere. Even a relatively healthy tree only adds a few pounds of wood per year, where the wood is storing the carbon for at least on the order of decades to centuries, but even that will all eventually end up back in the atmosphere. This enhancing the land biosphere, biomass burning thing, it just doesn't help that much. While we're thinking about things that might help, hey, I heard we don't need to worry about this anymore anyway, because I hear that we're using clean coal now. Oh, I hate that term, clean coal. The problem is the term clean coal has come to be used to mean lots of very different technologies. Nothing we do can make clean coal a clean technology. Clean coal is the dirtiest of all the fossil fuels. I mean, basically it's a rock, okay? And we pull it out of the ground in its natural state, and it is full of stuff that is not what we planned on being in that rock. Okay? A lot of it is hydrocarbons that we're going to be burning in the combustion chamber of a coal-fired power plant, but there's also other crap in there, like sulfur and so on, that we're going to have to deal with. And there are different senses in which we can clean this, but none of them are going to make it clean. I mean, for example, one of the kinds of things that many states and some federal governments and so on require is for coal-fired power plants to have so-called wet scrubbers that remove some of the pollutants that come out of the flue gases when we burn the coal. The flue is, you know, like the smokestack. So there are these wet scrubbers that can be used to remove sulfur dioxide, which, you know, is a pollutant and has all kinds of roles in acid rain and so on. The nitrous oxides, which are strong greenhouse gases, and especially a lot of the particulate matter, in particular, no pun intended, black carbon. These things can be fairly inexpensively removed using a wet scrubber. There are also ways to control what actually happens in the combustion chamber at a coal-fired power plant to reduce the pollutants even being formed in the first place. Like there are these low NOx burners that reduce the creation of these nitrous oxides in the first place. Then you don't have to scrub them out. They weren't even created in the first place. This exists. I mean, it's a solution that your local power company might have implemented. And then when you get your electric bill, they have a flyer in there, we're using clean coal. Well, kind of. I mean, you have addressed an important problem, the nitrous oxide, but that doesn't make it clean. You're still pumping millions of tons of carbon dioxide out the flue. Alright? You fixed a problem, but that doesn't make it clean. There's also, for example, electrostatic techniques that apply electrical charge that works particularly well on the particulates, again, no pun intended, but like incompletely combusted bits of like black carbon and so on can be removed by applying this electrical charge, and then the particles settle onto these plates that can be cleaned. Again, I mean, as they well should, power companies brag when they implement these things and so on, that, you know, they now have clean coal, and you should feel good using coal, and I'm a friend of coal, and all this. In southern Indiana is coal country. Well, I take back, it was coal country. Most of the coal plants are closed, coal mines are closed here because they can't compete with natural gas. But, you know, people drive around with bumper stickers on their cars that say, Friends of Coal, coal is clean, and, well, getting better, but we still haven't dealt with the giant elephant in the room that is all that carbon dioxide. There's also a whole strategy, I'd forgotten I had a slide about this, about coal washing, which removes the things that, even before it gets to the combustion chamber, they have techniques where they can grind the coal up and then wash out the materials, especially sulfur and so on, that are going to be causing problems for pollutants. This way, they never even made it to the combustion chamber. You got the pollutants out. You got the things that are going to be pollutants out of it before you even got to the combustion chamber. So there's a whole bunch of these kind of techniques that remove impurities before the coal gets even into the combustion chamber. Again, that is a strategy the power company should be bragging about. That's a big deal. They spent millions to do it. But none of this has done anything about the carbon dioxide, right? I mean, you put in 1 million tons of coal over the course of this day, and you're going to put about 1 million tons of carbon dioxide back out the atmosphere, okay? Doesn't quite exactly balance, but it's pretty damn close. And that's kind of, from a climate point of view, the problem, right? I mean, we need to figure out what we're going to do about carbon dioxide. Now, excuse me, there are some promising technologies about this here. You've probably heard of carbon capture and storage, where carbon capture actually takes the flue gases that would have otherwise just gone out the smokestack, and there are ways to scrub the CO2 out with a combination of temperature changes and solvents and so on, and steam is involved in it, and again, there's a whole industry involved in separation of gases and so on, and this can be done. And it's expensive. And it's an ongoing expense, right? I mean, it isn't like we just put a piece of equipment in it there and now we don't have a problem. Now we have, every time we're running the coal-fired power plant, we're producing carbon dioxide, and we got to get it out of here with carbon capture and storage. Now, part of that can be offset by the fact that there is a way to sell carbon dioxide, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But, I mean, ballpark, we've got it. So I could envision that this could be made to work. With the right technology, with the right economic model, we could make this work where there'd be no net escape of carbon dioxide from your coal-fired power plant. You somehow captured it all. You pulled up a train full of coal and nothing went out the smokestack. Yeah? What you gonna do with all that carbon dioxide? I mean, you've now got all the carbon dioxide that came from a coal load of train. What you gonna do with it? Where could you safely store all this carbon dioxide? I mean, if it got out, well, there'd obviously be a huge, amount of carbon going into the atmosphere. That would be a climate change issue, but there's also a suffocation hazard. Carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere don't have to be all that high for you to not be able to breathe. Now, this isn't exactly what you think it is. If you watch a movie about a submarine or a spaceship or something like that, Apollo 13 or something like that, oh, we're running out of oxygen, okay, that's just TV. No, that isn't going to happen. You are not going to run out of oxygen. 20-some% of the Earth's atmosphere, the atmosphere in their spaceship, in their submarine, is oxygen. The problem is, the carbon dioxide concentrations are getting fatally high. Okay, when they say we're running out of oxygen, what they really mean is we're suffocating. We are no longer able to get carbon. The mechanisms your lungs use to get carbon dioxide out of your blood and into the atmosphere, to be breathed out, require there be a gradient of carbon dioxide from between your body and your lungs. So as carbon dioxide in the ambient air goes up, you eventually can't transfer carbon dioxide out of your bloodstream into your lungs, and you die. Okay, your blood can't pick up enough oxygen anymore. It's not that there's out of oxygen in the atmosphere. It's a crazy idea when you think about it. I'm going to tell you a very dark story about how easy it is to suffocate from carbon dioxide. Oh gosh, it's probably been almost 10 years ago now. I had a problem. I still lived in Omaha. I had a problem. We got one fall a bunch of mice in our house. It's a long story as to why I had mice in our house. We never had mice before. I put out traps and I caught 16 mice. Can you even imagine how horrifying it is to catch 16 mice? And every trap had snapped on them, and I found them and the mouse was dead. Except the 17th one. One trap had just caught the mouse by its leg, and the mouse was sitting there screaming at me. Now, there's people out there who would step on the mouse. There's people on there who would get out a knife and chop the mouse, but I am not that person. I did not know what to do. And then I remembered that the day before in my class, one of my classes, physical meteorology, we had actually done an experiment, and I had a chunk of dry ice in my car. You know what dry ice is? It's frozen carbon dioxide. So what I did is I went out to my car, got a piece of that dry ice, set it on the floor next to the mouse, and put a bowl over it, thinking that I'm going to smother this mouse with the carbon dioxide, right? I mean, it's going to be a gentle way for the mouse to die, and it'll be done. I thought this would take... I was horrified. I thought this was going to take like hours, before that mouse was dead. I was going to have to sit there and listen to that mouse scream. That mouse was dead in 5 seconds, okay? It was amazing how quickly just that much carbon dioxide wiped that mouse out. That's why when you do an experiment in a chemistry class or a physical meteorology class that involves carbon dioxide, you have to certify that you have a certain amount of ventilation and so on, because your students could die. Okay? It's surprisingly easy to die from carbon dioxide. So getting back here to slide 42, what I'm saying is we have to be very careful. If we're going to store carbon dioxide, we can't just have big tanks of it sitting on the outside of town. Because if they ever leaked, we could kill people. Or, I don't know, a terrorist blew up the tank or something like that, or whatever. We literally, not to mention the climate impact of letting all that carbon dioxide back out, but we can literally kill people. So we need to have very, very safe ideas about how to sequester carbon dioxide. This is not a simple thing. Most of the plans do not involve giant tanks sitting on the outskirts of town or out by that refinery or out by that power plant. They generally involve sticking it way underground. Partly because at the very high pressures that you experience under, a couple miles or a couple kilometers of rock or whatever, you can keep it as a liquid, so it's more efficient as to how you can store it. You can't really have carbon dioxide as a liquid at the surface of the Earth very easily. Now, there are ways then you can pump carbon dioxide liquefied down into the ground and it will stay. There are capture techniques, and then we can put it down deep where hopefully it'll stay for at least hundreds of years until carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere come back down to pre-industrial levels. We'll have to learn at some point as how long that's going to be. But you can see that there's all these techniques on this diagram here about geologic storage. There are ways down deep in the Earth's crust where we could store carbon dioxide fairly safely. Liquefied carbon dioxide can be dissolved into saline formations. There are unminable coal deposits because they're too deep or something like that. Well, actually liquefied carbon dioxide dissolves into that kind of stuff, and so you could actually store the carbon dioxide down deep in these unminable coal deposits. Oil fields that have been depleted now have empty space. You could pump the carbon dioxide into there. There are solutions where this could work. Now, you have to be really, really sure and have all these geologic studies in advance to make sure that carbon dioxide is never getting the hell back out of there. But one could envision these things could work. There's also a whole set of horrible ocean storage solutions that involve the fact that carbon dioxide, again, becomes a liquid down below about 3 kilometers of the ocean. So whether you have a pipeline where you're pumping the carbon dioxide directly down from a plant, from a power plant along the coast, or whether you actually load it up into ships, or you have some kind of platform at sea where you could dump it down deep. Well, if it's deep enough, you could literally put you could make liquid carbon dioxide lakes on the bottom of the ocean, Oh, there's an environmental impact there. I can well imagine that's not good. Or you could actually put liquid carbon dioxide and dissolve it into the ocean at a depth of about 3, or not quite 3 kilometers. There's other ways you could actually put gas carbon dioxide into the ocean, all of which have horrible, horrible ocean impacts with regard to ecology. All these things involve ocean acidification and so on. These are not great solutions. But these people are thinking. I mean, but we just have a problem here. Now, as it happens, all these solutions are going to be expensive. The good news is there might be, if we can get the cost down enough, there might be ways to make this at least not entirely uneconomical. For example, there are byproducts, there are industries that need carbon dioxide. The soft drink industry, okay? The carbonation of soda involves injection of carbon dioxide. They buy carbon dioxide. So you could use some of the carbon dioxide that you recovered through your carbon capture and sequestration strategy and sell it to the Coca-Cola company, and that would partially offset the costs. Obviously, all that carbon dioxide ends up right in the atmosphere once you have the beverage, but at least it's helping pay for getting other carbon into the ground. Okay, one could envision this could be made to work. The dry ice industry. Okay, they buy carbon dioxide and convert it to dry ice. Okay, again, that is a market. You're not going to get rid of gigatons of carbon that way, but you might sell some carbon that way, which could pay for the model. The gypsum, like drywall type industry and so on, there's carbon dioxide involved in the processing of some of these steps and so on. So, okay, you cannot get rid of industrial quantities, gigatons of carbon this way, but maybe this can be made to work. But maybe there's a whole set of other solutions we could ask a climate professor about that could be solving our problem for us, like this whole business of geoengineering. Now, in the 4th module of the course, we're actually going to have at least a whole lecture, if not more, about geoengineering. So I just want to nibble at this a little bit today in the context of like radiative transfer and so on, because that's what we're doing in this module. You've probably heard this idea of having some kind of shade between the Earth and the Sun, reducing the amount of radiation that comes to the Earth in the first place, kind of like sunglasses for the Earth. Now, for a lot of reasons, it's not possible to make like a giant shade for the Earth. What you have to have is literally billions of small satellites deployed between the Earth and the Sun, able to reduce the amount of solar radiation actually reaching the surface of the Earth. Okay. Could we do this? Well, we actually have, you can follow that link and actually see the study that I used and so on. It would take about 10 billion of those satellites, and they would be, let's say we went in there in the next 30 years, that's 10,000 days. So if we did the math here to get them there, that means we would actually need to get about 1 million of those spacecraft to the position between the Earth and the Sun. It's called the L1, the Lagrange 1 point between the Earth and the Sun. We need to get 1 million of them a day up there for the next 30 years. Just to give you a sense there, what we would need is we would need 1,000 factories working around the clock, making each one making one of those satellites every minute for the next 30 years. Do you really think we can launch 1 million satellites, spacecraft a day? The scale is not really possible here, right? You're getting the sense here that this is just not really something that we can do. Another geoengineering solution that could come up in conversation would be this idea of geoengineering low clouds. Very related to what we talked about earlier in this module, where we were talking about how inadvertently we changed the albedo of clouds with the sulfur emissions that come from ships. That was those ship tracks that you see there, right? Those are the grayer stuff and the whiter stuff. That's all just low clouds, but the low clouds are whiter and reflect more sunlight away from the surface of the Earth when they had more aerosols in them, in this case from the ships that were passing underneath. We could do that on purpose. There are geoengineering strategies that involve, like, we actually deliberately increase the amount of aerosols in the atmosphere to make clouds brighter. In fact, we kind of already inadvertently do that because actually, based on anthropogenic aerosols, all clouds already are somewhat whiter than they were in a pre-industrial world. But you can envision that we could come up with a plan to do such a thing. But all these plans suck. They're too expensive, the scale is too big, etc. But at least we talked about the ones today that involve like radiative transfer and so on. Now, before we finish up this module, let me just ask you 6 quick questions about what we've learned today. Question 1. Some power plants buy clean coal to use in the production of electricity. In this context, clean coal is coal that has much of its naturally occurring blank removed by any of a variety of processes. Is that sulfur, carbon, oxygen, or nitrous oxide? What are they removing when they clean coal before they even put it at the power plant? I mean, there's places that clean coal and then they sell it to the power plant. What are they removing? Make a choice from those 4 options and get a little feedback before you move on to question 2.